Let's talk about HTTP and mainly the observables. So this is mainly the part which we have seen in the previous class, right, regarding the services. So now we know. So we used multiple components talking to single service, and single service is actually providing the data, which is kind of sharing data across different components, right? That's what we have seen. So now, so when we talk about multiple components here, like employee, we have seen the employee names is a separate component, which uh, together they were actually talking to one common service called employee service, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is something which you have seen now. So moving one step ahead. So here what we did, we created a service, and this service was actually serving these two components by providing data. But the data was hard coded here, right? If you remember in our previous class, so
Yeah,
when we were actually using the service called employee service, employee
I
service, anyways, in turn was calling common service, but the data was actually kind of hard
thought.
coded. But in real time situation, what happens? The service in turn talks to some APIs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, there can be situations where service may want to read data from the files or anything, but most of the times, right, it will be reading from the endpoints or something called as HTTP calls, for instance, HTTP or HTTPS calls, right,
Mm-hmm.
which we also call as a REST calls or API calls, right, or endpoint calls, whatever you want to call it. So, for which we normally use something called HTTP client, right? So we'll be using the HTTP client service, which is we'll talk more about how we can actually use a client to actually grab some data over the network or using a HTTP call and then serve the components with the same feed which we have hard coded here. Okay. Now, so in order to understand that, right, we have to understand few steps. We'll go step by step to understand how the HTTP call is generally made. Okay. So so when we talk about HTTP, see, I actually mentioned here HTTP and observables. Now, what are these things? Now, HTTP or I would say HTTP client, which is one of the service we have under Angular APIs or Angular services, will be used to actually talk to endpoints, right, or REST services.
Mm-hmm.
And observables is something which actually creates a subscriber for us, which will actually create a asynchronous wait, right? So in general, if you take real time scenarios, right, whenever we actually make any REST service call or any API call, we can't actually wait or we can't actually freeze the screen till we get response, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what do? We just trip the call and we'll leave it. I mean we normally render the remaining part of screen, right? And
Yeah.
once we get response, then what we do? Whatever response we normally receive, that response will be rendered, or that response will be populated into screen or components in a way we want, right? So
Yeah.
now in between the tripping of a API and whenever we get response, something should actually raise an event or raise an alarm saying yes, you got a response for the API call you did,
Mm-hmm.
and yes, now you can use it. So that element is nothing but an observable.
Okay.
Okay. So sometimes there are other concepts like promise. Promise is like, once we actually make a asynchronous call, just leave the sync fire and forget, and just keep the promise extracted out of the endpoint trip call. And as soon as we get response, promise will automatically know that yes, for this request you have got a response. Now go ahead and use it. That's how the observable will be used. Okay. Observable is actually not an Angular API or service. Observable is a RxJS component, which is React to Expression JS component, which is recommended to use in Angular basically for all the asynchronous API calls we normally make. We normally create an observable awaits. Okay, we normally subscribe them to the observables, and observable can be used across different components we have. Okay, so that's first thing. So, and then once we get the response, observable will be whomsoever subscribes into the observable, they will actually get the message response, and as soon as we have the response, they can actually use it. Okay, so to divide into few steps, let's see step by step. First step, what we have to do, we have to register our HTTP client basically. Okay, which is an Angular HTTP client. Okay, to our module. Fine. Now, second, now we have to go into service and then make HTTP call, right? So while making HTTP call, we need some URL or API. We will see, we don't have to create a complete altogether a REST API to see this. We'll see this through a URL, but a file which will be created in the same directory. Okay. And for this, we'll be using HTTP. So this is a HTTP client module I'm talking about, which is altogether a different module in Angular API, Angular CLI, and then we'll be using HTTP client, which is Angular HTTP client, to make HTTP call. Clear?
Mm-hmm.
Now, third step. So for this URL, right, what we'll do, we'll just create a, a content file in our local, and we'll use this as a URL. Okay, URL in the sense we'll give this URL to make it HTTP. See, HTTP call end of the day is like we can actually provide anything. It can be a over the network, it can be a file content, right? HTTP just does understand whenever we give any streaming capable things. It can be a direct file, it can be URL or stuff. Okay, but end of the day, the way or the process of reading HTTP is like this. And then okay, so the fourth one. So now this third one is kind of, I can say it as like just 2.1, not the major step, because we're going to just create a source for this. Now once we have this call made, now we are going to actually make an observable. Okay, so once we make the observable, see, observable is something which can be created and also can be casted based on the response. For instance, if you are actually expecting some response, so if you see the existing um, example we are seeing, we have a simple object of a symmetric properties, right? And this is a type of shape we have, right? So our object shape is, so every object we created here have got ID, name, and address. So this is a certain object type we have. So while using observable, we can also provide a casting object, casting object type, so that whenever we get response, the observable will automatically convert the content of the response into the casting object, and that object will be served whoever subscribes it. Okay. Now the fifth step, what we are going to do is we are going to subscribe to observable. So subscribe to observable is nothing but, what do we need to subscribe? Because I have personal info here, right? I have
Mm-hmm.
employee names. These are the two different components which are kind of reading through a single service, right? So
Mm-hmm.
now I want the data here, and I also want the data even in this component, right? So obviously, so this component should subscribe to my observable created in service. Also, this component should actually subscribe to the observable we created, right? So that's why I'm saying whomsoever want, they can actually subscribe. Now once they subscribe, once they get response, they can utilize the response. Let's see all these things in action now. Okay, step by step, and we'll see how we can actually get the same data, whatever data we were actually printing here, right, by hard coding stuffs here, right? We'll see how we can actually get the same stuffs using our service HTTP call. So now first step, what we did, we mentioned that we have to first subscribe the module, HTTP client module, into our parent module. Now, which module we are in? We are in app module, right? So we have to go to app module.ts, right? I'm going to subscribe. First, I'm going to import my, so I'm going to take the import. Oh, sorry. I'm going to take the import statement. So here I have Angular slash. So under common, we have something called HTTP. So in HTTP, we have HTTP client module, right? So this module is required across all our components of services which are under this module, for instance, right? So I'm gonna do register this. So this is a module which is an Angular. So now how can I actually register it? Now I have to actually import it. All the modules, you remember, whatever modules we have, we normally import to all the components across here. So I'm going to register here. So as soon as I register into my parent module, so whatsoever components are under this module, they are now they actually understand what exactly is a HTTP client. That's our first step. It's clear.
Mm-hmm.
Now going on to the next step. Next step is make a call. Now in this we have two different things. One, okay, we need to prepare the URL first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now for this URL, let's create a simple file. Now where can we create a simple file? If you remember, we were talking about something called assets, right? Now you can create files anywhere. It's not that you have to create only inside, but this is a placeholder for all the files or for all the raw files basically, or static files we normally create. It can be file icons or anything. Okay. So we'll be using most of the times, right? Even in future for learning the forms and stuff, we'll be using this and we'll be creating more files here. Okay. So now, so let me create a simple data. So inside these assets, let's create my new folder. Let's say I'm gonna call it as source. Source is my folder. So inside this source, I'm gonna create a new file. So in this file, let me call it as we were actually talking about employee details. So let me call it as employee.json file. Okay. So in this file, what I'm gonna do, we need data, right? So I'm gonna go to common service. I don't want the data to be hard coded here, right? So I'm gonna remove it, keep it here. So now as this is a simple JSON file, it is not a TypeScript file to actually not by default cast or understand the properties. So we are going to bring on the actual properties we have. Okay. So let me just make it as a real JSON format object so that JSON understands what exactly is going on. Okay, perfect. So now we have this file. Let me just use this with a simple data. So now this employee.json file is going to be my source, which is simple like a which having a server and a database. Okay, think as if this is a database where I'm actually storing my data. Okay, and automatically when I say JSON, it acts as a database and also as a server, and it feeds me the data whatever I have already fed here. Okay,
Okay.
now let's go to employee service here. Excuse me. So in this employee service, if you see here, we have a we already have a method called a get employees, if you remember, right? And this get employees is actually consumed by child component, I hope. Not the child component. We have created many more. Let's open up. Oh, we have an employee component, right? Let me just close all. Let's open up employee personal info. I hope we created this employee personal info where we're actually reading the service and employee names, right? And we have a service called employee service. Perfect. So employee info is one of the component we have where we are actually reading the data through service employees, if you see here. And we also have second component called employee names, where we are also reading the data here in on init, right? Now, let's go to this service now. So in this service, what we have to do, we used to actually have a hardcore data. Now we have to convert this to HTTP call. Now how to do that? Now first, what I'll do, we need a HTTP client to actually make a HTTP call. First step. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually inject my HTTP client. So how can I do that? I have a private, let me create a simple HTTP client. This is a variable I have of type HTTP client. If you see here, one moment, I have to select the right HTTP client, which is my Angular one. So Angular common HTTP, we have a service called HTTP client. Fine. So now this employees, we're going to convert this employees into the steps we did. So now we are all doing this stuff actually now. Okay. Now in my get employees, what I'll do, I'll just remove this step. I'll say this dot HTTP client dot. See, we have all the HTTP verbs you can see. We have get, we have options, we have put, we have post, we have delete. So based on the API HTTP verb you have, right? If you have a endpoint for which accepts HTTP post, you can use a direct post here. You can see if you have a HTTP get, you can use direct get, right? So as we are going to have learn the services during our express class, right? So during that moment of time, we're going to create all different type of services, and we'll see how to consume them in here, okay, based on different methods here. So now let me select a get here. Okay. So now if you see the comments here, it says in get we have many options to give. So now, but the main and the mandatory argument which you have to provide is a URL, right? Now this is a place where we normally give an endpoint URL. Now here what we're gonna do, we're gonna give the URL of the file we created. So we created file under assets. So let's take that. So let me create a simple source URL. So source URL is nothing but, so we're gonna take this assets. So it is under my assets and source, and it's employee.json. So these are fine. I'm gonna give the source URL here. This dot source URL. Clear? Now this is how we normally make a HTTP calls here. Now we are not done yet. So what we are doing here, we're just saying that okay, fine. We are doing a HTTP call. Now HTTP calls are always asynchronous calls, right? Always what it does, if you see here, if you see this comment here, when I make a get call, it's gonna actually give me some observable, right? Observable is nothing but the one which actually makes the you can see here an observable of a response body as a JSON object. Why? Because the source URL actually understands that it's a JSON which is going to return. That's why it says yes, I am actually capable of returning a observable. Now, but here we are actually not, we haven't actually created any observable yet. We'll see that part. But as we are in the second step saying yes, we have to make a HTTP call. Yes, we did that. And then what's the URL? We just created a simple file and we gave the URL of this. Now this is our source. Perfect. Now our HTTP trip is ready now. Now HTTP is ready, trip is ready, but how can I use it in my component? In order to use it, you have to enable your observable for a return type. So the return type of this can be observable, so that observable can wait till response is received. Now, if you remember during our discussion, I said observable can cast an object type. You can actually have observable with a casted or a generic provided type, so that whenever the response is received, it can type the response into required format. Now here we talk about something called models here. If you remember, we were talking about a service and a model, right? What is a model? Model is nothing but a kind of a shape or a structure of an object which is symmetric with the response we are receiving. So now we know that what type of response we are going to receive. If you open up employee JSON, I know that this is a data of a type of object and this object contains different properties. So now what I'm going to create, I am going to create a model for this service, right? So we have employee.service.ts, which is extension for service. We know that it's a component.ts, which is for components, and for models are direct ts files, right? So I'm going to create a direct ts file now. So I'm going to minimize this in app itself. In the see, you can actually create anywhere you want. If you have actually created a separate section for all the employees components and all the feature, you would have created altogether there. But as my employee components are at an app level and my service is at an app level, I'm going to create here itself. Okay. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new file, right click on new file and say employee model.ts. Fine. So this is going to be my model. Now, so when we talk about model here, it's a simple interface which have the structure of the object we are looking for. So I'm going to create an export interface. Let me call it as, it's an interface, right? We're going to call it as iEmployee, for instance, right? This is my uh, model which I'm going to have. And now let's maintain the same. So I'm going to have ID and I want the ID as a string. I'm going to have name, let's say string. I'm going to have what do we have? Address as string. Clear? Now we have a model now. So in this way, you can actually create any number of models you want, which matches with the response you're getting from server. So now let's see how we can actually use this model, right, in our components here and also in my observable, so that I know that, okay, the same model is being served across different components. I'm going to go back to service. Here I have something called, if you see here,
Mm-hmm.
so here I can actually give I'm employee of array because I'm gonna get the employee array. If you see here, as soon as I type in, right, anyways, this we have to import the file. What's our file name? Our file name is employee model. If you remember, we created a TS file
Mm-hmm.
which is employee, and we're importing it because we already created a model which where we are actually exporting this to consume, and we're consuming it here. Clear?
Mm-hmm.
Now here what we did, we just are typing casting here saying, yeah, I'm gonna get some response out of the source URL, and that response is going to be automatically casted to this type. Okay, and the same thing I'm gonna use as observable. Now this is going to return observable. If you see here, the return type is observable, right? So as I'm returning the same HTTP get response in my get employees, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna have the return type as observable. So observable is from RxJS, if you see here.
Mm-hmm.
So this is from RxJS. Let me just take it from quick fix. Yeah, here we go. So observable is from RxJS internal and observable. Okay.
Okay.
So we're gonna have observable, and what type of observable we need. So that's what I said. Observable can cast an object. I mean, you can hold the type of data which can be returned here. So now what type of data we are actually returning? It's employee array, right? So this is going to have employee array. Clear? Now this method is completely asynchronous now, and I can have an observable whenever I call my employee get employees function of the service, and I can just use this observable and subscribe to it. So when I subscribe to this, it automatically gives me response whenever this get is resolved. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see how to use it. Now my service is ready. So now let's get back to our picture here. So the service is ready. HTTP calls are done. Now we have registered our we have the observable ready. Now we just have to subscribe to observable. Now how to do that? So let's go back. Let's go back to page and see what is happening here. If I refresh this, I think there will be nothing, right? As of now, there is nothing here. So let's go to personal info first. Let's go to personal info component here. Now, if you see this component here, now you're getting the error because this employees is no more returning a direct employees, right? Now, what does it do? Now, let's see how I can actually map these employees. So first thing what I said, this returns a observable, right? So this returns a observable. So let me take it as observe. I'm just taking to one variable. And this variable, what I have to do, if you see the next step, is to subscribe to the observable. Now, how can I subscribe? Just say observe dot. If you see, we have subscribed. So when I subscribe, what happens? I get the response. So let's say I'm gonna say just a variable RESP for instance, and this response I can use it. This is how we map it. So this response, what I'm gonna do? If I mouse over this, see what's the response there? It's a array of employees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I can do, I can use my local variable, a component property, saying this dot employee details, and then assign my response. And now if you see, if you remember in our previous class, I said we can restrict this with a type, right? Now I'm going to restrict this with employee type. Make sense?
Yes.
So now I'm restricting my employee. So which means this employee, in order to actually use this component, you have to add employee model. Clear now? So this is how we subscribe. And once we subscribe and leave it, whenever we get response, it automatically populates it. Whenever this is populated, what happens? It goes over here and populates this one. Let's go back and see. Can you see this now?
Yeah.
So this is an object which is served from a file. If you remember, we created a file here.
Yes.
Employee file here. Now I can just add one more, for instance. Let's say this is kind of a database. I'm just adding one more. Something, and then some address. Save it. I'm gonna save it. Go back. Can you see?
Yeah.
So everything is happening through the HTTP call, and this is actually reading from observe. Let's go to the other component now. So other component, employee names, also want the same employee information, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm gonna do, I'll go to the same employee names. This time I'll not create any variable now. I'll just directly say get employees, which is returning my observable dot.
Subscribe.
Yes. I'll say dot subscribe of, let me call it as R. R is my response. And then what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna use my employee details and assign it to R. R is nothing but my response, right? So whatever we are actually returning here, if you remember, I'm returning this response, right? So that's the same response I'm putting here. And also what I can do, I can restrict my
Employee.
perfect. So now this is my model, this is my service, let employees, and this is my HTTP call, this is my observable, getting back, I'm subscribing it, I'm getting the response. Simple. And this response, if you go back here, see, we have this. So if you I mean, now it's all live. Whenever, I mean, as we are actually calling on every trip, that's why it is coming up here. And now let's go back and remove one of them. Let's say I'm going to remove this Raj, save it, come back, goes off. So whatever is happening now is happening through this. So let me just show you by debugging. You want to see the debugging one?
Yeah.
Let me show you so that you get more
So
understanding.
what is the difference between employee names component and employee personal info component? The steps are same, right? Both.
Yeah, so only difference is in employee names. If you see the HTML, we're just taking names. Whereas if you see the personal info, we want all of them. But source of
Service.
these two components are same.
Yeah, service.
Sorry.
A service file, like
Uh,
service thing.
mhm. Yeah, in service file. What's the question?
So we are using only one service file to display in different components, different.
Exactly, exactly. For maybe whomsoever want to actually get some employee details, they can use this employee service across,
Mhm.
and the same service will serve everyone. So if you go into network here, right?
Mhm.
Let me just refresh it. If I refresh this, right? So here, you will see some of the calls here. If you see, can you see the employee JSON call here?
Yeah,
So one of the call, because why there are two calls?
two components.
Exactly, because one component is first component is calling here. You can see asset source employee JSON, and what's the response? Can you see response?
Yeah.
So these are we normally going to uh, dev tools and read the network. So what's the second trip again? Employee JSON. Again, it's asset same, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
it's a get call if you see,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then what's the response we're getting? Sys. So that's how
Okay.
you see the responses. Now let's go to sources here. Let me show you how it actually works. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, we know how it works, but let me show you. Let's take one component and service. Let me go to service here. So I'm gonna take the employee service. So this is my file. I'm gonna keep breakpoint on employee service method. Oh, we went to the component, which is okay. It's fine. And also open up the service. Fine.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So now I have employee names component, which is actually calling get employees on initialize, and this get employees is nothing but my employee service get employees, and this is making a trip. Okay. Now let's go back and let me just clean this off network, come back to sources. Now let me refresh. What is happening? So it immediately tripped the first component and initialize it hit. Now where it is going? It is trying to trip get employees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So now when I do F10, now can you see it went into my service and it is here. So what's the URL that we gave? The URL is asset source JSON. Now if I go back to network, the network I don't have employee JSON, right? Let me just clear everything, come back here and just say F8 again. Now this is the second call I got. Now if I go back to network, can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
This employee JSON is the one we just made a HTTP call. This same HTTP. But now I got this breakpoint again because this is from second call.
Mm-hmm.
F8. See, second call.
Mm-hmm.
Now if I go back to sources again, now if you see, I've subscribed this, you remember?
Yeah.
Now as soon as my response is done, the subscription resolved and my response, I got response. If I mouse over R here, see, can you see all the data?
Yeah.
I have all the data here, whatever data we need. And the same R we are assigning to R.
Okay.
So if I
Yeah.
just do F10, can you see employee details now?
Mm-hmm.
And the same employee details are coming. Okay, a few things which you have to remember is HTTP call, create a observable, subscribe for observable. That's all. So the subscribe for observable is wherever you want. I mean, in whatever component you are looking for, you can subscribe and wait for it.